Fantastic. Hi, everybody. This is a bittersweet moment because this is actually the last formal Global Encounters and First Nations peoples seminar. So it's going to be, I'm sure it's going to be sad for all of us when it's finished. But thank you for joining me tonight. Before I begin, obviously, I want to, well, first of all, before I do anything, I might share my screen. That would be, oh, David, can I put, thank you, sorry.
Right.
Okay. Ooh. Off to a flying start, Lynette. Okay. Okay, there you go. All right. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge, obviously, that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people whose histories and knowledge sit at the heart of everything I'm going to share with you tonight, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I also want to acknowledge many people in Indonesia, particularly Makassar, who have contributed to this journey and indeed have redirected us and navigated us when we were a little lost. So tonight, I'm going to focus on not so much the outputs of Global Encounters, you can find those on our website. I want to go big picture, a sweeping narrative of what we tried to do, how we went about it. I could enthrall you with tales of our travels to Indonesia, the Philippines, Korea, the Netherlands, Portugal, England, Vanuatu, and beyond. But instead, I want to offer a reflection on the motives for those journeys and the journey of encounters that we've had along the way. So, but first, we happened to start in 2020, about a week after a global pandemic was announced. So the thing we had to do and had to do quickly was pivot. So what do you do when you've got a project that's very heavily focused on travel and you're not allowed to travel? So you really do have to hit the online archives. And the question that came out of that and has come out of the project and in a sense has guided us all the way is what happens to history, and not just Australian history, but history as a discipline, when we put Indigenous perspectives at the centre of the story rather than at its margins. When we create an encounter history, which now I think stands as a unique field, and what happens when we widen what counts as evidence. These are some of the many, many people that accompanied us and supported us on our project. I'm just going to move that a little closer to me so I can see it. Okay. Sorry, I hope you can still see that and I haven't messed it up. Now, let me state this claim quite plainly because I'd rather you disagreed with me on something precise than nod along to something vague. Australian history, and I will argue, encounter history, global encounter history, looks radically different when you put Indigenous perspectives at the centre rather than the margins. And once you expand the kinds of evidence you are willing to take seriously. Not different in the sense of a footnote that you could add or a chapter that you could include, but different in the sense that the whole shape of the story changes. Who the protagonists are and where the centre of gravity sits, even what counts as Australia in the first place. So I'm going to make the case in 4 moves tonight. Seeing, knowing, caring, and sharing. Each word names a different kind of work, an epistemological problem, a methodological answer, an empirical case, and a question about who scholarship ultimately is for. Seeing asks whose perspective has survived in the historical record and whose has been rendered invisible. Knowing asks what counts as evidence once you stop assuming the only evidence worth having is the kind that was written down by people with the power to write. Caring is where I spend the longest part of tonight's talk because it's the empirical heart of the research. 1,000 years of Indigenous maritime history embedded in the most dynamic trading network on Earth. And sharing asks who this kind of work is ultimately answerable to, not just who we should include, but also who gets to decide and for whom is the knowledge actually for. Okay. Here's a simple but under-examined observation. Every act of recording of an encounter is also an act of reframing. When 2 parties meet for the first time, a ship's crew and the people on the shore, say, Someone decides what gets written down. That decision is never neutral. It encodes a vantage point. Look at the European Archive of Encounter in Northern Australia. The logs, the journals, the colonial reports. The vantage point is overwhelmingly consistently the deck of a ship. The narrator stands on board, looks outwards to the shore, which recedes in the distance as a backdrop. The inhabitants appear as figures in a landscape, curiosities, obstacles, or resources to be assessed for usefulness or danger. The ship is assumed without argument to be the place from which history is made. Now imagine that encounter from the shore. What tools did the people standing there have to record what was happening to them, and what, for our purposes tonight, counts as evidence? There are three things that matter here. The first is painting. Artists in Northern Australia have a tradition of recording significant events, including the arrival of outsiders, in paintings on rocks and on bark that were part of the living and ongoing visual culture, not necessarily relics in a museum case. Images of Macassan prows, the distinctive sailing vessels of the Trepang trade, painted onto rock surfaces along the coast, are often remarkable in nautical detail. Sails, rigging, hull shape, a kind of detail you can only capture if you have watched these vessels closely and repeatedly. Then we have oral history. Oral history, accounts of encounter collected and still being collected across Northern Australia, the names of specific Macassans, details of seasonal visits, the texture of relationships that lasted generations. These are not alternative sources that happen to exist alongside the European archive, waiting to be added as a corrective footnote. They are full accounts in their own right, and when you sit with them, they do not just supplement the European version of events, they frequently contradict it. They render it strange, or even ask questions that you might never have thought to ask. I'm going to give you two concrete examples. In 1606, the Dutch vessel the Duifken made contact with the Wick people at Cape Queer, one of the earliest documented European encounters with Aboriginal Australians. The Dutch have an account, and we have Wick oral accounts of contact with strangers from the sea, still held by the Wick community. Read side by side, this is not one event with two descriptions, but two events that happen to share a location and a time. Different protagonists, different stakes, different meanings. The question this raises is not which account is more accurate, but what would it take for you to hold both in your head at once without collapsing one into the other? The second example is even more telling. Matthew Flinders' meeting with Pabosso in 1803. We know this encounter from Flinders' journals, where Pabosso appears as a minor figure, a local informant, useful for what he could tell the English about the Trepang trade and the routes the Macassan fleets followed. But Pabosso was a senior captain operating within an established and sophisticated trading network that long predated Flinders' arrival. Reading the encounter from both sides, taking seriously what we know of Macassan trading practices and seniority, not just what Flinders thought worth recording, can give us a completely different picture of who held the knowledge and who was teaching whom. This is what I mean by reciprocal perspectives, a deliberate method of reading encounter archives against the grain, refusing to let the absence of written Indigenous accounts stand in for an absence of Indigenous perspectives. The perspective is there, it's just not always there in the written record, the way we were taught to look for it. Let me close this section with a slightly harder version of my claim. This is not simply an argument for adding Indigenous sources alongside European ones, more evidence, more inclusion, more job done. It requires a new habit of reading, asking new questions and documents that we thought we already understood. And this is the uncomfortable part, sitting with accounts that do not resolve into a single authoritative narrative. Sometimes the bark painting and the ship's logs disagree. Sometimes we need to understand that there is no winner. We cannot adjudicate one as correct, the other as not. We need to ask what each version was for and whose interests it served to tell it in that way. That's seeing. And now to go to knowing. If seeing is about perspective, knowing is about evidence. Here's an observation that's going to sound obvious once I say it out loud, but it has radical implications if we take it seriously. The traditional historical archive, logs, journals, colonial reports, government correspondence, was not built as a neutral storage system. It was built by people who had the power to write, organised according to what they thought was worth recording, and shaped by the purpose of empire. It tells what empire wanted to know. It is a far less reliable guide to what actually mattered to the people empire was writing about. So if we want a fuller account of the past, we cannot simply read the existing archive more carefully. We have to expand what we are willing to count as archive in the first place. And I mean that we need to consider a host of things other than the written word. And this is often something historians, for some reason, struggle a little bit. So and I've just got a couple here: trees, words, pottery, and feelings, just those four. Trees. Tamarind trees are not native to Northern Australia, we know that. They grow today at points along the Northern Australian coast that correspond with extraordinary precision to the landing sites and resting places of the Macassan treepangs fishers over centuries. The seeds were incorporated into the soil as the visitors passed through. And it's important, and one of the things that's really come out to us is Macassans did not plant these trees, and many Aboriginal people did in fact plant them, but they certainly deposited the seed. A tamarind tree is not a metaphor. It is a physical, datable, locatable evidence of sustained presence, and a kind of evidence that a ship's log was never designed to give us, because it doesn't show up until decades after a single voyage, and only becomes visible if you look at the coastline rather than a cargo manifest. Next is words. Words. Yolngu-Mata, Yanyuwa, Andelewaka, Iwaja, and other Northern Australian languages have absorbed loanwords from Macassan treepangers. Linguists have traced these specific terms back to the origins of the treepang trade. What loanwords tell us that a ship's log cannot is the intimacy and duration. You do not borrow vocabulary from people you meet once in passing on unequal or hostile terms. You borrow it from people you live alongside season after season, closely enough that the languages start to lean into each other, and borrowed words become shared terms. Pottery and glass. Archaeological sites across the coast contain the material residue of exchange, fragments that are read against the trade records from Macassan and Chinese sources. They allow us to reconstruct what was actually moving between communities as opposed to what colonial authorities thought was moving, or indeed wanted to be moving. Expanding the archive is not a tidy additive process. Reading the expanded archive properly means working alongside archaeologists, linguists, and botanists. It also means working alongside communities who hold this knowledge of those collections that drew over without ever naming. That is not a methodological nicety, it's closer to an ethical precondition. The questions other disciplines might ask and the answers communities hold consistently produce truer accounts of the past than we find in colonial records alone. This is a hard point. It's really an important but hard point. I want to talk about something that is very difficult to recover, and that is affect. What can we recover from an expanded archive of the feelings that animated these encounters, not just the transactions and the occasional well-documented conflict, but the care, the curiosity, and the grief, the affection. The expanded evidence increasingly shows that the treepang trade generated lasting bonds of kinship, adoption, intermarriage, friendships that crossed the Arafura Sea and outlasted a single voyage. None of that shows up in customs records. It shows up in oral histories, it shows up in songs, it shows up in art, it shows up in stories. To be clear, my argument is not that that trade was simple, harmonious, or free of exploitation and the occasional violence. It was not, and I do not want to romanticize it. It is an argument that the existing categories, exploiter and exploited, colonizer and colonized, are too blunt to capture what our expanded evidence shows. Relationships of mutual dependence, genuine exchange, and real affection sit uncomfortably alongside real asymmetries of power. Both things can be true, and the expanded archive is what lets us have both of these at once without flattening the past into a story that is slightly more comfortable. This is both a scholarly method and a political act. Deciding that tamarind trees and loan words and oral testimony count as historical evidence on the same terms as ship's logs is a form of decolonising knowledge production, and it redistributes the epistemic authority away from the institutions that produce the written record and towards those communities whose pasts are actually at stake. And oddly, it's been one of the most controversial parts of this project. I think maybe because some of us trained as archaeologists before we entered into history, we didn't have a problem with this kind of idea of borrowing from various different disciplines. But it was one of the more controversial things I encountered as I presented this evidence around the world. So I'm going to move on now to caring. Oh, there's a tamarind tree. Caring. Here's a conventional history of Australia, one most of us were taught in one form or another. It begins in 1770 with the British arrival. Before that, there is what used to be called prehistory, a static, isolated waiting. After that, there's history, contact, conflict, colonisation, and the whole apparatus of nation building. I'd like to demolish that starting point because the violence of it is not merely factual. The date is most certainly arguable. It is also structural. The story in 1770 positions Aboriginal Australians as a people without a prior international connection, without external relationships, without a place in the wider world. All of these things are things that we know are completely untrue and not most of all, at least most importantly, because of the work of Campbell McKnight, which had a profound impact on us and the project we did, and of course how we understand that pre-European history. But Aboriginal people most certainly did operate with international connections. They certainly, it makes the isolation and the concept of the default condition of them being somehow trapped here and contact with Europe, the only event capable of ending it, a complete nonsense. Northern Australia was not isolated before 1770. It was connected through a trading network of extraordinary reach, sophistication, and longevity to what was at the time one of the most dynamic commercial systems on the planet. Now, I'm not just talking about the trepang industry. Let me give you the shape of it. First of all, we traced three broad phases, the drift or exploratory voyages, perhaps beginning as early as 1,000 years for the present. And this is very much based on the work of Ian McNiven and Annie Clark and others. That, we argue in several publications, continues through to 1550 or thereabouts, in which likely the contact was intermittent and opportunistic. Then came a period of voyaging entrepreneurs, which we argue probably went from, these are very rough dates, 1550 to 1750, in which visits became more deliberate and frequent, and then perhaps from around 1720 onwards, a truly formalised trepang industry with established routes, camps, and seasonal rhythm that persisted for the better part of 2 centuries. That rhythm is worth describing because it tells you that this was not a series of isolated voyages, but genuine and sustained system. The trepangers, the sea cucumber fishers, sailed from the south from the port of Macassar on the western monsoon winds, leaving around December and working the trepang grounds in northern Australia through the wet season, and then sailing home around March or April once the seasons turned. They did this, the archaeological and oral evidence suggests, for centuries. This is not an encounter, it is an institution. The archaeological record bears this out independently of any single document. Trepang processing sites along the northern coast preserve smoking hearths, stone processing lines where boiling cauldrons would have sat, fragments of imported glass and pottery, the material signatures of a process repeated on the same site season after season for generations. None of this depends on a single systematic witness with a pen. There is in the ground datable, locatable, and corroborated independently by oral testimony that names the very places that archaeologists have since excavated. Macassar itself deserves a moment of attention because it complicates the national story on the Indonesian side of the Arafura Seas as it does as much on the Australian side. The crews who sailed to Australia were not a single homogenous group. They were certainly Bugis, Baju, Bhutanese, Makassarese, and many others drawn from across the maritime Southeast Asian archipelago, sharing the same prows, routes, and seasonal calendars. Macassar functioned as an entrepot, a meeting point for multiple trading peoples in much the same way great port cities have always functioned as thus, places where identity is plural and commerce is the common language. What was actually moving through this system? Well, trepang, as I've noticed, the dried sea cucumber harvest and processed on the shores of Arnhem Land, the Kimberley, and right across Northern Australia, destined for the Chinese medicinal and culinary markets, where it's commanded real value. But notice that it was travelling alongside and in the same general trading world as the cloves moving out of Maluka, nutmeg moving out of Banda. That is part of the spice route, a network historians have spent centuries studying. But the Australian tree-pang industry was not adjacent to it or downstream of it. It was part of the same integrated world system. The southern extension of the spice route, I would argue, runs through Northern Australia. And if that sentence sounds surprising, then the surprise in itself is my argument. It tells you how thoroughly the conventional story has trained us. Not to look south at all, just keep looking north. Once you see this clearly, a question almost asks itself. If Australia had this commercial and cultural entanglement with Southeast Asia 1,000 years, up to 1,000 years before Federation, what does it mean that the nation's foundational story so consistently looks to Britain and the Pacific instead of to Indonesia, to Makassar and the Banda Sea? I don't think that's an accident of emphasis. I think it's a structural feature of how colonial historiography has organised significance, and undoing it is part of what we've tried to do over the last 6 years. So move on, one more. Now, who were the people on the receiving end of these seasonal arrivals? And I'm going to use that phrase deliberately because receiving end concedes far too much passivity. So let me correct that as I go. Aboriginal people were not passive observers of the trade that happened to occur on their shores. They were hosts. They were workers. They processed trepang alongside visiting crews. They were traders, exchanging goods on their own terms. And in many documented cases, they were partners. And oral histories make this undoubtedly and unmistakably clear. They were also kin. This is where the expanded archive really earns its keep, because none of this richness survives in the customs ledgers. It survives in oral history. It survives in the detail, and the detail is remarkable. Northern Australian communities have held oral histories to this very day, ones that name specific Macassan captains, not a captain, a named individual, remembered across generations. They record exchanges of goods and sometimes of people through adoption and intermarriage. They record violence too when it occurred, for this was not a relationship free of conflict. But alongside that violence, there's also bonds of affection that lasted generations, long after any individual voyage ended. And this is not just oral, it is also preserved in the rock art, those images of the Macassan prow I mentioned before, or in the ceremony and the songs the Northern Australian communities have to this day. And right now we have one of our PhD students who's come from Makassar, who's currently embedded with the Yanyuwa people, and he's doing a wonderful study looking at Yanyuwa's connections to the Macassans, and he's taking a course from a Macassan perspective. Unfortunately, he's up there now and he can't be here tonight. These images, this ceremony, the song, the stories, they're not antiquarian curiosities. They are living transmissions of a relationship that mattered enough to be kept. This is, I think, the single most important reframing the project has to offer. The standard story of contact in Australia casts Aboriginal people as recipients of history. Things happen to them. Empires arrive. The frontier advances. The trepang trade gives us 1,000 years of evidence for the opposite model. Aboriginal Australians as active participants in an international commercial and social network on terms that they help set, generating relationships of genuine reciprocity and affection alongside the inevitable frictions of sustained cultural contact, cross-cultural contact. This is also where the deepest stakes of seeing and knowing land. The reciprocal perspective I described earlier, reading the encounter from both sides. We've talked about this as, looking in and looking out, and we've also talked about standing on the shore and standing on the boat. These only really become fully visible when you've done the work of expanding the archive. To move into the oral histories, the rock art, the song, the loan words, each move in this talk has depended on the one before it, which is why I gave this section a little bit more room than the others, because this is where the method plays out empirically. I'm going to close this section with a small human detail because it does more work than any amount of observation. The oral histories do not just record the existence of relationships between Aboriginal families and Macassan visitors. They record affection of specific enough, that is specific enough to have a texture. Whom taught whom to fish a particular reef? Who was given a particular name? Who was mourned when news of a death finally made its way across the sea? That's not the vocabulary of an exploitative trading relationship, nor is it the vocabulary of an equal one. It is the vocabulary of something much more complicated, something much more human than either category allows. And the recovering of that complexity is what this expanded historical method is intended for. Now I want to turn to a different type of question, not just what happened, but what this scholarship is for and who it's answerable to. These questions matter just as much as the empirical ones. And while I've spent the previous minutes describing those other questions, this is it's not separable from the empirical work, because this sharing, this collaboration and democratizing of knowledge must be there from the start. So here's the premise I want to defend. And I've been defending this for a long time now. When I was president of the Australian Historical Association, I gave my presidential address, and it was called A Plea for Interdisciplinarity. And in a sense, that could be the subheading of tonight's talk as well. But here's my premise. I want to defend that history is a public good, that it is true, and if that is true, the scholarship that investigates a community's past should be answerable not only to other academics, but to the community. To an academic audience in an institution as old as Monash, that might sound like I'm asking to lower the bar, but I'm not. I want to argue the opposite. I want to democratise the access to the research, which in my experience results in a sharpening of the rigour, not a softening of it. So let me show you a little bit of what this looked like in practice. You'll see here on our different columns here, you'll see that some of the things I'm going to talk about. So these are 4 things in particular, which treated individually sounds like outreach activities. And I was really conscious that if I came along tonight and just told you everything we had done and everything we'd produced and every article and every book, it would just be a big list and it would be pretty uninteresting. So instead, let me tell you how this has looked in practice. Those 4 things in particular, as I said, can look like outreach activities, the sort of things funding reports tabulate under impact, but taken together, they are primary evidence for the argument that I am making here. Scholarship is answerable to the community, not diluted scholarship. The first, and in some ways the foundational piece of work, has been our partnership with the University of Negri Makassar, and I believe I saw Abi on before. This is not a partnership in the thin sense of the word that often gets used in grant applications. It's meant co-authoring across the Arafura Sea, Australian and Indonesian researchers working from both archives, both sets of oral histories, both scholarly traditions, arriving at accounts that neither side could have produced alone. It also consisted of running workshops where we could actually sit with our Macassan colleagues, particularly postgraduate students, and mentor them and talk to them and work with them to produce work that they would not have been able to produce had we not done so. Now, when an Indonesian colleague tells us that a loan word meant something in 19th century Macassan commercial usage, and an Australian colleague can tell you the same word came to mean something once Aboriginal people speakers absorbed it, you get a history with genuine depth of field on both sides of the strait, not one written from the shore, footnoted to the other shore. The second thing we've produced, and you will have seen this because we did a presentation on it and you'll probably remember it, it's our interactive digital map of encounter sites. This was something that came out of our collaboration with our wonderful colleagues in the Faculty of Information and Technology, and it's something that I think our entire team remains extremely proud of. But it's the format that matters as much as the content. The map is organised around Indigenous place names rather than the names that colonial surveys imposed later. And it doesn't just relabel the coastline, it recenters the geography itself. Northern Australia stops looking like a remote edge of a southern continent and starts to look like what actually was. A populated, connected, navigable coast at the southern end of a much larger maritime world. And because the map is digital and interactive, it's never going to be a finished object handed down from the university. Communities can contribute to it, correct it, add to it. That's not a minor technical detail. That is an argument about epistemic authority built into the infrastructure. In its early iterations, several encounter sites on the map were marked using names drawn from old survey records. Community input changed that, not as a courtesy, but because the corrected place name carries the information that the survey name did not. For example, seasonal use, ceremonial significance, relationship to neighbouring sites. The map gets more accurate, but it also gets more respectful because we let the people who hold the knowledge correct it should they need to. The third pillar is the Awakening Histories exhibition that opened at the Monash University Museum of Art in 2025. Developed with 9 researchers and curators from across Australia and Indonesia, and opened fittingly by the Indonesian ambassador. I think of this exhibition as a counter-archive, a way of making a historical argument in a medium academic publishing can never reach. You cannot footnote a feeling the way a painting or an installation can convey it. People who will never read a journal article about a trepang trade walked through those galleries and came away with a different sense of Northern Australia's history and what it actually contains. And the fourth, perhaps the closest to my heart, maybe just because we've only just finished them, are the children's books that we've produced from this research. Children's books for the years 10 to 12-year-olds, which are going to be illustrated and be published by Thames and Hudson. We have one on the Dutch, we have one on our Pacific neighbours, we have one on the Macassans, and we have others that we would like to develop in the future. I'd like to resist calling these simplifications of research or scholarship. They are translations. Like any good translation, they are acts of interpretation in their own, shaped by the priorities and the storytelling instincts of the people who've made them. And one of my great hopes, and it's one of the things that we've talked about with our colleagues in Makassar, is that we certainly hope that Thames and Hudson will be open to publishing the Macassan volume in Bahasa, Indonesia, which would be wonderful. So what ties these 4 things together? It's a question this whole project keeps returning to. Ultimately, who owns the past? Not as an abstract puzzle, but as a practical, urgent question about authorship, access, and authority. Our answer, worked out gradually and not always comfortably, has been that ownership has to be genuinely shared, with real consequences for who gets to shape the narrative, not merely consulted with as a courtesy before the academics then go off and proceed as planned. I'm not going to pretend that this is always comfortable. Collaboration across institutions, languages, and scholarly traditions takes longer than working alone, and it occasionally means living with disagreement rather than resolving it with the sake of a tidy publication. But the alternative, a faster, tidier history written from one shore alone, is exactly the kind of history that this project exists to argue against. So I'm going to close this section with reframing what matters the most, and that's decolonising history, which doesn't simply mean adding Indigenous stories to the existing frameworks of historical scholarship. New chapters slotted in, new sources cited, while the underlying architecture of the discipline stays the same. It means questioning those frameworks themselves, asking who built them, whose interests are being served, and generally open question what different architectures of historical knowledge become possible once communities have tools and access and authority to change and shape accounts of their own past. So let me come back to where I started. Oh, I probably should have pointed out, we did actually take a huge amount of published, unpublished, and printed material back to Makassar with us, but we've also made these things available through a Google Drive, and most importantly, they're currently being corrected because I've had a few things pointed out that they were probably needed correcting. Okay, so let me come back to where I started. And none of this is mine alone to claim. It belongs to our colleagues at Makassar State University. It belongs to our colleagues at the Marega Institute. It belongs to the Northern Australian knowledge holders who have shared oral histories built over generations. It belongs to the artists and curators from both sides of the RFUSC who have done as much to shape the argument as to document any document and in any archive. And of course, to my amazing colleagues, the Global Encounters Monash team, GEM. It's hardly surprising that GEM won both the Dean of Arts Research of the Year team and the Vice-Chancellor's Researcher of the Year team. It's not, it's to me, it is an amazing recognition of the incredible people that I have worked with over these last years. So I asked at the start a question: what happens to history when you put Indigenous perspectives at the centre and then widen out what you consider to be evidence? And I hope that what I presented earns a strong claim. Genuinely global encounter histories are collaborative, accessible, Indigenous-centred by design, not as an afterthought, not as a chapter, not added after the real history's been written, not as a gesture of inclusion bolted on at the end for the sake of the grant report, by design from the start. The treepang industry, the treepang trade is proof of the concept of this claim, and it's worth stating in its starkest form that this 1,000 years of Australian history is also simultaneously and without contradiction island Southeast Asian history. It is as I have said, and I will continue to argue, a southern extension of the spice routes, populated by named captains and remembered kin, by hosts who were never merely hosts, and by partners who were never merely passive. It became recoverable only once we were willing to widen both perspectives, what counts as sources and what counts as evidence, from bark paintings to records, bark paintings as records, tamarind trees as data, oral histories as rigorous testimony rather than colour, and loan words as proof of intimacy rather than curiosity. The implications of this extend well past my own little corner of Australian historiography, which is why I want to bring this very bold argument to beyond the academy. I don't want to keep it within disciplinary conversations where it started. Every discipline that's here tonight, we talked about botany, archaeology, and others, every discipline I've discussed tonight has an archive built into it. At some point, it serves as a configuration of power. Every discipline has a version of the question that I'm leaving you with tonight. So let me leave you with two questions, rather than a tiny summary, because I think it's more useful than anything I could conclude on your behalf. Okay. First, what would it take for your own areas of research to be expanded in this way? Not added at the margins, but genuinely widened, so that forms of evidence that your field does not currently recognise as evidence start to count. And second, harder, and I think ultimately more important of the two, who gets to decide who owns the past and on what grounds? Not as an abstract question about historiographical theory, but a practical one with real consequences for whose voices shape the record and those whose do not. At the start, I said I wasn't going to focus on outputs, but in closing, I will point you to the reports, the blogs, the posters, the interactive map, and the other resources, along with the forthcoming books and articles, the Macassan PhD students who are now enrolled in Australian universities. I point you to all of those, and to my brilliant colleagues. I could not have done this alone. We will continue, as this project is coming to an end, we will continue with the occasional seminar. I'm just so chuffed that so many of you turned up every month for the last 6 years. It's amazing. We will have the occasional seminar. I'm touting the idea of a book club. We now have a new YouTube channel. Our blogs and our ongoing association with UNM is absolutely core to what we're doing. In fact, the team, we're all self-funding ourselves to go back to Macassan next year to attend the Biennale. So for now, it's adieu. Or perhaps more appropriately, Sampai Jumpi Laga. Thank you. Stop sharing, Lynette. Okay. Goodness, there's lots of people in the room. I can't see everybody, but it would be lovely. Anybody wants to put their hand up, please? I've got two notes that I wrote as I was thinking. One is I filled 8 moleskins. So that's a feat. And the most, I think, something really significant that's come out of this project is that I have been appointed the Global Humanities Distinguished Professor at Cambridge University for next year, from April to May. It will be a 4-week period, and I will be presenting all of this in a very expanded and detailed way. So please, I'm really open to questions or comments. Thank you so much for coming along. Okay. Booty, did you put your hand up?
Yes.
Yes, please, Booty.
Congratulations. And also, I just bring my memories back to where we were in terms of connection and networkings and also conversations on the places that we went, as well as the plans that we executed, But one thing that I remember was a workshop in Manila, because
Yes.
at that time my mind was on Us. Remember from Brin?
Yes. Yes. Who
He
works
talks
on
about
Komodo?
yeah. He talks about salt fish, this little fish. He gave that presentation. And then, of course, since then, I've been in touch with him and encouraged him to expand. The point I'm making here is that through our encounters, we actually spread someone's own ideas to develop, In his case, us of course, saltfish, yeah. But then, of course, on the ground, when I was with Fikri, we talk a lot about stuff, including, I think, including there's a different commodities that the Trepangers took it with them on their boats, across, and also stopping in between islands along the way. So I'm suggesting maybe I always have this crazy idea. Maybe we should go to Rote Island. Rote Island is the most southern part of Ireland, just above Darwin, I think. Because
Yes,
I
yes.
believe the island was more or less the last island that many centuries ago the Trepangers
And
stop
that's
over and reach.
yeah, and Booty, Dedi Aduri from Bryn has
Yes,
been working there. So yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
What a
We
great
can ask
idea.
him to guide us.
Yes. Well, as you know, my next thing is I have to get to Ambon for no other reason. Obviously, lots of reasons to go, but I also want to go because my mother's brother is buried in the Commonwealth War Cemetery, and I'm going to incorporate that engagement, that relationship with Indonesia into the way I think about. But I can see Campbell has his hand up. Hi, Campbell.
G'day. I was just reflecting what I might say. It's so nice to travel over some roads that are long since traveled and travel again. But I think the thing I would want to say is we're winning.
Yes.
That the ideas that you have and the methods and so forth, they now are increasingly accepted, and especially in Northern Australia and in Indonesia, as you've demonstrated this evening. So I think we should go away believing that we're winning. There might be a few battles to go, but we're getting there.
Thank you. I think interdisciplinary, expanding the archive, thinking beyond the narrow confines of your own discipline. I think it's because I got trained as an archaeologist in the first instance. It just seems so obvious and so sensible to me. So thank you very much. And Campbell, can I say thank you? You have been an absolute stalwart attendee at almost every seminar. So we're enormously grateful. And in fact, I take great pride in that. So thank you. Do you have any other questions? Comments?
I've got one, Lynette.
Please.
I'll just jump in because I have the power to. I unfortunately my computer dropped out and I missed about 10 minutes of it. But I'm always really interested in this idea of history as a public good. I remember Inga Clendinnen in her Boyer lectures. One of my favourite quotes is, teach grown men and women a nursery version of their history, and you'll make babies of them when it comes to working out their place in the world. And she took a lot from Martha Nussbaum, who talked about history and citizenship and citizenry. And I think, yeah, this is a comment more than anything, but I think being able to look at these expanded archives, different versions of the story, look at a longer history, it actually more, it gives us a stronger sense of, for Australia, nationhood and citizenry. So yeah, I'm always really interested in that role of history in
I
expanding
completely
our
agree.
citizenship. Yeah.
And I think ever since we've had the job ready package from the government, and which has, made arts degrees prohibitively expensive, and it has had an impact on the enrolments of people in history degrees. And yet we know that history graduates and arts people with bachelors of arts are absolutely highly employable. In fact, generally speaking, we have a much greater employment rate with people with BAs than we do with bachelors of economics or bachelor of science. Not putting either of those down, but people come through who study history, who are taught to critically think, is so important. It's unbelievably important. And I also love the fact that with history you can have you can do such grand. I mean, this is a big, grand, sweeping scale that we were trying, but you can do the little micro histories too. And I don't know if people noticed, but today Carlos Ginzburg died, the wonderful author of the worm and the, what is it called? The worm and the, oh, I've got a blank. But anyway, a person who was just an extraordinary micro historian who told tiny, like a small story, but somehow made it so profound. So yeah, history is really important. And yeah, Inga was right. Teach people the fairy tale version, teach them the kindergarten or the storybook version, and they will never become grown-up history addicts. It's important that we make sure that doesn't happen. Hi, Catherine.
Yeah. Oh, look, I'm so sorry. I am late to this discussion. This is the first of these I've attended, and I'm so sorry about that. I will certainly be going back and reviewing the website with great joy. Absolutely fascinating. I'm an art historian. We bring a different set of baggage to these kinds of problems, but also an interesting sort of way of tackling the world, looking at it through the image. It's not image, not as illustration. Image as holding knowledge of its own.
Yeah. Fantastic.
It's a lovely place to be in some ways.
Yeah.
I am interested, as somebody who thinks hard about decolonizing archives from a pictorial point of view, I'm interested in the idea that we can use a decolonizing methodology to tackle the previous knowledge set. You've kind of created a knowledge set in this talk anyway, without kind of digging into previous preconceptions. So I'm wondering how you've done stuff, how you've worked with really challenging pre-existing archives like the Mountford expedition.
Yeah, we've been very cautious, I would have to say. Things like the Mountford expedition, we're very, very cautious. If a community doesn't, and we've actually had a couple of communities request certain things not be used, so we haven't used them. And we've had quite a significant lot of conversations around these topics associated with the Monash University Library, who's actually instituted some very strict regulations on what you can and can't review. Once upon a time, you could go in and you could pull Mountford off the shelves and have a read of it, but that's no longer the case because the community said we like mediated access or no access. So that's what we've done. Arby, I can see Arby's hand up. You're on mute, Arby.
You're on mute.
Can't hear you.
Yeah, okay. Okay, you can hear me now.
Yes, we
Okay.
can hear.
Thank you, Lynette, for this presentation. And yeah, I really want to share my perspective from Makassar. And we are in Marege Institute and Makassar State University. And all the colleagues in Makassar really want to say thank you for Global Encounters working project in Makassar from 5 years ago. And I can say that. I think this is what the feeling our ancestors working together from 100 years ago. Not just about the topic, but how we connected, and that's why we are in Makassar really connect. Really feel connected to Australian and the and indigenous and Aborigine and First Nation people in Australia now, but really important for us now in Makassar with this Global Encounters project. Yeah, with this Global Encounters project in Makassar in 5 years, we can share many stories about our ancestors for our youth people in here. Yeah, we have. Usually we mention about the book from Campbell McKnight. To for yeah we work we mentioned the book of Campbell McKnight in 2017 when
Mhm.
we work with Makassar Biennale, and but with the Global Encounters we can share many stories about that again. And with that, with in Marege Institute with support from Global Encounters, now we have a Jalo Tripang book written by youth in Makassar. So this is two books now in Makassar, the Voyage to Marega from Campbell and the Jalo Tripang book, the idea from Tami, our colleague from Islamic UIN, Alaudin. We have these two books now, and this is very important to share the stories to our people in Makassar. And yeah, I just want to share my feeling about it. It's not just about the working together with Global Encounters, but this is the feeling that uh, our ancestor of feeling 100 years ago, we feel connected. We really feel connected to you all in Australia for now.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Arby, and
I
I can
just want
assure
to
you
say.
we feel connected too. So
Yeah.
Marion, I got you, and then I've got Will. I saw baby Tom on his lap before, but he's obviously gone. But go, Marion. You're on mute, Marion.
Okay. Thank you so much for all of this. I have learnt so much by tuning into you over the months. And I just really wanted to say, to follow up Leonie's comment, that one of the enormous political problems we have in Australia today is the childishness of people's understandings of race, of contact, of inside Australia and out. So if there's a miracle that needs to be worked, and maybe you can actually do a bit towards working it. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marion. Will.
Yes, thank you. And yeah, congratulations. The baby was here and then he was going a bit nuts. I just wanted to congratulate you and thank you for being a supporter of, I think there's so much deep research here, but I feel like you've also done an incredible job of broadening out this whole space and supporting journalists and filmmakers and trying to get a sort of more fundamental knowledge across Australia. So I think that's been a real achievement of this whole project. And I'm kind of excited about the way you're framing this as a sort of extension of the spice route, because that's the way that I came into this whole story. And I think that getting the Chinese interested in this element
definitely.
further, there's just so much that can be done with that. And I'm really excited about the kind of next chapters of how that can be worked into First Nations diplomacy and concepts of politics and all these sorts of things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Actually, speaking of diplomacy, I can see Tummy's online. Tummy and I and Morgan Briggs are proposing a panel we'll be using the Tripang industry as a form of diplomacy. and sort of informal treaty making at a conference. We're offering that at a conference that's going to be held in Bangkok in February on Southeast Asian treaties. So it's going to be quite exciting. So that's my next thing I have to do is write that panel, that proposal. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. I think we've got a final slide. Is that right, David?
Yeah.
Unless anyone's got any more comments. No? Okay, let's go.
People see that? Yeah.
Here we go. This is the QR code. What does QR stand for again? Someone told me. QR. I can't remember.
I don't know,
Anyway.
but it's very simple.
It's very simple. You just put your phone on that and you can download. Sorry, Ian?
Thank you, Ian.
Quick reference. It's something very technical.
I kept thinking it was something complicated. So that is the QR code for Leonie's magnificent, massive volume, looking in and looking out. That will take you straight to it. These are all of these things are also available on the website. We are transferring the website. It will remain on Monash as long as Monash keeps it there. But we've decided that we would hedge our bets just to make sure that somebody didn't come along and just go, oh, Lynette Russell doesn't work here anymore, let's get rid of that, which is always entirely possible at universities, I'm afraid. So we've actually bought a domain name, and I've got it for 10 years, and it's going to be available there as well. And as you can see, we also have a Global Encounters YouTube channel, which consists of Pandorite as well. Thank you. Good point, Rosalie. Thank you for that. I hope somebody is saving the chats because I can't keep up with all of them. Thank you so much, Tummy. Yes, you are indeed a Macassan woman studying political studies and international relations at University of Queensland. One of the things that really does make me unbelievably proud is that two of our colleagues that we've worked with in Macassar for these years, key parts of our research team, are now enrolled in universities in Australia undertaking PhDs. And that is a very significant achievement. So congratulations. So yes, we have a new Global Encounters web email address, again, because I think it was last year at one point suddenly Monash just stopped having our Global Encounters at Monash. So we've actually now got a Gmail account just so that we can control that. And as I say, the YouTube channel has all of the seminars on it, and it has our symposiums. However, it doesn't have the full recordings of the 2 8-hour sessions that we did when we went to Jakarta and we worked with Bryn, thinking about these issues from an Indonesian perspective. That will be available on the website. Sorry?
It also sadly doesn't have Campbell McKnight.
I know.
Our first seminar was from Campbell in 2020, and that was before we knew how to record these. So unfortunately, we don't have a copy of Campbell's, but we have everything from 2021 onwards.
I think I have a copy, David. I'll send it to you. I'll look.
Oh, that would be
amazing. That's
that would
amazing.
be amazing.
Thank you so much.
Well.
Also, if any speakers who've given a seminar for us over the years would not like their seminar on the YouTube page, just let us know. I'm going to be emailing all the speakers to make sure we have permission. Also, currently the new Global Encounters website directs to the interactive map that we did with Tom Chandler and the Monash IT department. In the coming weeks, we're going to be migrating all of our content from the Monash website over to that new address, and the interactive map will be part of that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So that takes us up to 7 o'clock. So it is a bit bittersweet, I must say, but I'm so grateful to everybody who's been involved in this project. I'm just delighted with everything we've done. Of course, we've only done about this much of what I thought we would do. I was reading through what I'd promised, and I don't think we delivered anything. One of the problems with these grants, to be perfectly honest, is they ask you to promise things that you can't possibly ever deliver. So consequently, you make grandiose promises and then you do the best you can. So,
but you know what, Lynette, we have delivered much more and much broader than that limited description in the ARC application. Yeah.
So thank you, everybody, and Summer, see you later. Bye-bye.
Sampai jumpa lagi.
Sampai jumpa lagi.
Thank you. Thank you, Lynette.
See you.
Mantap, mantap.
Mantap.